Rishi and to Jeremy for at least allowing me to be able to be with you virtually. I look forward to seeing everyone in person, back in person on Thursday morning. B'sha'a tova u'metzlachos. Today's daf is Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Vav Amud Beis 6b, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem Amar Le Rava Barav Chanan LaAbaye, which is 2, 4, 5 lines up from the bottom. So if you remember again, the Gemara was speaking about the idea that Bia Rishona on Shabbos may not necessarily be a Psik Reisha. Why is that a Psik Reisha? Because there's a concept of Hatiyah, of literally angling or positioning oneself in some way that the Bia Rishona doesn't necessarily or automatically cause the rupturing of the Basulim. We spoke about it again yesterday. She had the concept that perhaps this has to do with being able to manipulate the elasticity of the Basulim. Okay, in any event, the Gemara says, now that we know that this is possible, so Elame Ato, so Amalei Rava Bar Rav Chanon LaAbaye, Elame Ato Shoshvinan Lama, Mapa Lama. And we'll see, we're going to get into these sugyas a little bit later on, but we'll see that there were certain things that were instituted in order to go ahead and ensure that the husband or the wife doesn't make any false claims. In other words, we could have a situation where a couple gets married, and let's say a husband wrongly accuses his wife of not being a basula. Or a woman claims there was dam besulim, there was hamino blood, when in fact there wasn't. So we're going to see that Chazal put into place a couple of different pieces. For example, shoshvinin. Shoshvinin, if you look at Rashi, shoshvinin lama, me'achar shesh bekin liva below dam, hadatayin lekaman. We'll learn this again in about a week from now. Hayu ma'amidan lahan shesh shoshvinin echalo ve'echala, kadesh l'shames esachosim ve'esakala. They would appoint on the wedding night 2 attendants. One to take care of the chassan, one to take care of the kala. What was the role of the attendants? So for example, we're going to see that part of the role of the shoshvinin was to make sure that, let's say, the sheet that upon which the bia rishon was clean, right? So that, in other words, no one planted anything there with blood so as to falsely claim. Mappa is the same idea. Rashi says, Lavar Sabasulim, a clean sheet to be able to go ahead and see if there was dam nida. Again, we'll see these ideas later on, but the point over here is, if we're accepting the premise that hatiyah, that a bia rishona with this angling that allows a person to have, again, there's penetration, but without the rupturing of the basulim, so then why do you need all of these other things to ensure that no one's making any fraudulent claims? To which the Gemara is very simple. Amar Hasam Shema Yira V'Yovad. No. There's a different issue. The issue we're concerned about is, let's say the marriage is not consummated with hatiyah, and we're concerned that if there was blood on the sheet, which would again would be a testament to her basulim, perhaps that'll be lost. If you look at Rashi, Amar Shema Yira V'Yovad, Shema Lo Yata V'Yotzi Dam V'Yovdu V'Yomar Lo Matzasi Dam Dilu B'Atiyah. So remember again, what's the concerns? Why do we have the shoshinu? Why do we have the attendants? Why do we have to make sure? Why do we make sure that there's a clean sheet? Because in the event that we don't want to make sure that let's say the sheet gets lost or that there's no testimony, then the husband can make a fraudulent claim saying that halacha lamaisa, there was bia rishona and there was no dam. So therefore, in order to prevent fraud in a case where hatiyah is not used, we have these other things in place. Incredible. So says the Gemara Masiv Rabbi Ami raises a kasha. Ha-matvis mursa b'Shabbos. I will say this is a case, matvis mursa literally means that one is creating an opening to drain a blister or a boil. That's what's happening over here. It's like popping a pimple, but again, it's not a little pimple, it's a boil. So one is creating an opening in order to drain the boil. So the Gemara says, Im lasos pe'achayiv, if my intention is to create an opening, then I'm chayiv. Right? Ultimately, again, why am I chayiv? Because Rashi says, last Rashi in Daf chayiv, Shema metakin pesach, shehu metakin pesach, v'chayiv mishum bona, because I'm creating an opening. Creating an opening is the malacha of bona, is the malacha of building, and therefore halacha l'maisa, I'll be chayiv. I'll be chayiv for that. But if the reason I'm opening up the boil is to drain the pus or to drain the liquid, then ultimately top of Zayin, potter. Ultimately, again, then I am potter. Take a look at the top Rashi and Zayin Amudal. Rashi says the kaimelon, the potter umotter lechatchila b'yasio Shabbos kash leman da'aser da'hai nami lahotzi damu. So interestingly enough, Why the Gemara is so here we have Rabbi Ami raising this as a contradiction to the whole sugya of dam besulim. So how do we go ahead and distinguish? Very simple. Hasam pakid va'akir, hacha pakid v'lo akir. So it's actually very interesting. When it comes to the boil, we assume that any liquid or pus that is absorbed in the boil is fundamentally pooled and totally and wholly detached from the body. Whereas dam besulim, as much as we had opinion that said mifkat pakid, even though it's pooled and somewhat detached, there's still an element of attachment and absorption in the body. In other words, what the Gemara is very interesting. The Gemara is making here is making a fundamental distinction between a boil and dam besulim. So the boil, the pus, is totally separate outside of the body. The dam besulim, as much as it is pooled and it's absorbed in a particular area of the body, and it might not fully be absorbed in the rest of the body, it's also not fully detached, which is quite interesting. And that's why, again, it could very well be that even if you say that halacha lamaisa, the boil could be opened up on Shabbos to drain it, that may not necessarily lead you to the conclusion that bia rishona is permitted on Shabbos. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says hasam gabi lecha, by the boil, pakid kanus biachad, the pus is totally pooled and outside of the body. Va'akir, Rashi says, kulam min abas va'amid latzeis, it's detached from the body. It's considered to be separate and distinct from the body. Hacha dam besulim, when it comes to dam besulim, whatever Rashi says, pakid v'lo akir, it's pooled or it's collected, but not totally detached. Rashi says, legamrei, elenivla ktsas biksalim. See, this is very interesting. Even though we were saying in yesterday's daf that perhaps dam besulim is pooled and detached from the body, it's not fully detached. And this really becomes clear when you compare it to the pus and the boil. Right? To the pus and the boil sits outside of the body. It sits in the boil, it sits outside of the body. Halacha l'maisa, that's different than dam besulim. Rashi says over Kishar, okay, so just interesting. So the Gemara just making a distinction here between the boil case and dam besulim. Rabbi Ami allowed bia rishona on Shabbos night, on Friday night. Amri lei Rabbanan v'halok siva ksuvasa. So I will say this is fascinating. So now we're bringing up another issue. So remember, up until now, the issue of bia rishona on Shabbos was an issue of how do we view the dam besulim? Is it a chabura? Is it a wound? Are you creating an injury, right? Or are you creating an opening? Now the Gemara says, even if you could find a way past all that, which we know that we can. If you hold dam mifkat pakid, that the blood is pulled and collected outside of the body, and you hold davar she'eino miskavein is mutter like Rabbi Shimon, then bia rishona could happen. Now Rabbi Abi comes and says, by the way, there's another issue. She doesn't have a ksuva. Now I will say, this is quite interesting because remember, in our mind, we assume that the way this wedding was happening, how? There's a wedding Friday afternoon, or for that matter, a wedding Wednesday, and it just didn't consummate. Either way, there was a ksuva already written. So it sounds like over here the Gemara is saying is perhaps again there was a minhag to only write the ksuba later on, right? The point over the Gemara is asking is what about a case where how could bia rishona be permitted if she doesn't yet have a ksuva? To which the Gemara says, Amar lahu at v'sua metaltlin, not a problem. If a woman doesn't have a ksuva, no worries at all. Just have her take some property. Look at Rashi. V'sua metaltlin. Tinu lo metaltlin tachas yada b'mashkon l'shibud ksuvasa ad sheyichtavu shtar ksuvasa b'shibud karkos. Both say this is fascinating. If you have a situation where a woman doesn't have a ksuva, so remember, we're going to see the halacha is that if a couple doesn't have a ksuva, they are not permitted to live together. Intimacy is prohibited. Living together is prohibited without a ksuva. So what happens when a woman doesn't have a ksuva? So interesting enough, what could he do? He could give her $30,000. He could give her a bar of gold, right? He could give her metaltlin, movable property, and that will suffice until they go ahead and get around to going ahead and writing a ksuba. And I will say it's actually incredibly important because a case that sometimes comes up is, let's say a couple can't find their ksuva. It's a real problem. The halacha is if you can't find your ksuva, you're obligated to go ahead and write another one. Let's say again, wife is going through her stuff. She's looking for a ksuva. Everything is okay in the marriage, but she just happens to be looking for a ksuva. And what happens? She can't find it. She can't find it. So now it's 11 o'clock at night. They can't find the ksuva. So what has to happen? They're not calling the rabbi, right? Don't call the rabbi at 11 o'clock at night over ksuva shilas. Right? So what happens? So now what do they do? What do they do? Does the husband have to move out? Do they have to sleep in separate places? So it's actually, so the post can bring down, there's a very simple eitzah. Let the husband write a check for the value of the ksuva. So let's say for $30,000. I'm just running a number, $30,000. Write a check for $30,000. And that could essentially, because what is a ksuva? A ksuva is an IOU. It's an IOU that has pretty significant liens against all types of property, but it's an IOU. So ultimately, again, in the absence of a formal ksuva, if husband could do one or two things, he could give his wife metaltalins. Let's say he has a very expensive bottle of wine. He has a case of wine or a couple of cases of wine. He could give that to her and say, here, this is for your ksuva. He could write her a check. And that would suffice until they get around to writing a replacement ksuva. So the Gemara says over here, if for some reason they came into Shabbos and for some reason she doesn't have a ksuva, so Rabbi Ami say, Bia is going to be awesome without a ksuva. No, you give her metaltal until you can finish writing the ksuva. Incredible. Rav Zvid, Shar Lemivel B'Tchila, B'Shabbos. Rav Zvid allowed Bia Rishona on Shabbos as well. Ike de Amri, others say, Rav Zvid Gufei Baal B'Tchila B'Shabbos. Right, some personal information over here that Rav Zvid himself, ultimately again went ahead and did the Bia Rishona on Shabbos. Interesting. Rabbi Yehuda, Shar Lemivel B'Tchila B'Yom Rabbi Yehuda allowed Bia Rishona on Yom Tiv. Says the Gemara, Amar Apa B'Shmei Derava. Lo tema b'yamtiv d'shari ha'b'shabbos da'aser. Now, don't infer from here that he only allowed it on Yom Tiv and not on Shabbos. Don't infer that at all. De'uad dinafilu b'Shabbos. And Rabbi Yehuda allowed Bia Rishona even on Shabbos. So why are we mentioning Yom Tiv? U'maiseh shahaya kach haya. That was the case. In other words, somebody came to ask him the shayla, is Bia Rishona permitted on Yom Tiv? So paskin, the answer is yes. But Lamaisi also holds Bia Rishona is permitted on Shabbos as well. Rapab b'shnei derava am b'yom tiv shari b'Shabbos aser. Very interesting. Rapab comes along and says no. No, in fact, the halacha is that Bia Rishona is permitted on Yom Tiv, but it is not permitted on Shabbos. Why the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tiv? Amarli Rapapi the Rapapa my daitech. So Rapapi said to Rapapa, why? What's your logic? In other words, why do you distinguish between Shabbos and Yom Tiv? Or I should say, why do you permit Bia Rishona on Yom Tiv and not on Shabbos? Very simple. See, so to which Rapapa responded, Mitoch shutra chabur letzorech. So we'll say that's just a moment. We know that on Yom Tiv there's a concept of ochel nefesh. That Allah one is permitted to do malacha for the sake of food preparation. And then we also remember again, we saw this. Kimar Meseches Moed Katan. We spoke about this extensively, where, I should say Moed Katan, I'm sorry, Moed Katan, Beya. We saw this sugya extensively, where the Gemara talks about the concept of mitoch shehutra letzorach ochel nefesh, hutra namish letzorach ochel nefesh, which essentially means as follows. Any malacha that is permitted for the sake of ochel nefesh, of food preparation activities, will also be permitted for non-food preparation activities. In other words, once a particular category of malacha becomes permitted for Yom Tiv, it becomes permitted in all of its applications, not just food preparation. If that's the case, then remember both say, what's the whole issue with Bia Rishona is the drawing of blood. Right, the creation of an injury, of a wound, which essentially is a derivative of the malacha of shchita. Well, shchita is permitted on Yom Tiv. So for ochel nefesh, once shchita, drawing blood, is permitted for ochel nefesh on Yom Tiv, it becomes permitted for other activities as well, including Bia Rishona. But of course, the heter for ochel nefesh only applies to Yom Tiv, doesn't apply ultimately to Shabbos. Elamiata. If that's the case, so I will say, if that's the case, that we hold to the concept of mitoch. This is the concept called mitoch. Mitoch means once a particular category of forbidden labor is permitted for ochel nefesh, for food preparation activities, it becomes permitted for other non-food activities as well. So what we're positing over here is that once shchita, drawing blood, is permitted to go out and prepare food on Yom Tiv, it becomes permitted for non-food related activities as well, i.e., Bia Rishon, the first act of Bia. The Gemara says, okay, well, if you subscribe to the concept of mitoch, then perhaps what? You should be able to burn incense. Now, both say mugmar is not just any incense. Look at Rashi. Mugmar is bisamim ala ish. You would put incense on the fire. Ligamer es hakelim es habagadim, in order to give scent to one's utensils and one's clothing. So I will say, so in other words, remember havara, making a fire, burning something on the fire is permitted, right? You're allowed to cook food on Yom Tov. Well, once I'm allowed to cook food, then I should be permitted to burn incense as well in order to give fragrance to my clothing and to my utensils. To which the Gemara says, because once kindling was permitted for the sake of ochel nefesh, it should be permitted even for non-ochel nefesh activities like burning incense. To which he responds, Amrulay, Alecha Amarkra, about you, or about this argument. The pasuk says, Ach asher ye'achel l'chol nefesh. So Rabbi say the pasuk, when it refers to the heter of ochel nefesh, of preparing food on Yom Tov, says, Ach, only that, asher ye'achel, which will be consumed l'chol nefesh, by every person. Which means what? Davar hashava l'chol nefesh. So Rabbi say again, this is the whole sugya from Be'ah. We learned this already, that halach l'mais is a very interesting caveat here. As much as ochel nefesh is permitted, food preparation activities are permitted, and therefore by extension, once a particular malacha is permitted for food preparation, it becomes permitted for non-food preparatory activities as well, but it only becomes permitted for things that are considered to be normative, common pleasures. But things that are not considered to be normative, common pleasures, the concept or the heter of mitoch doesn't apply. So the Gemara suggests over here, burning incense in order to go ahead and give fragrance to your clothing and utensils, most people don't do that. Most people don't do that. Most people don't do that. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, that's not called the normative, everyday, common pleasure. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not mutar yom tiv. Contrast that with bia, with physical intimacy, which again is definitely something that's considered to be davar shava l'chol nefesh. It's a common thing that is enjoyed by people, and therefore, ultimately, again, it would be permitted. To which the Gemara says, Elame ato. I'm sorry, Amrli Ravacha, Brei Rava Ravashi. So Ravacha, right, Brei Rava said Ravashi, Elami Atin is Dami Lo Tzvi B'Yamtiv. Oh, so using this logic, that only things which are considered to be a normative, common pleasure are permitted to do malacha for on Yom Tiv. What happens if you find a deer? Are you allowed to slaughter a deer? Now, deer meat is very expensive, and most people don't eat deer. So perhaps, right, what was it called? I think it's venison. Right? So perhaps you shouldn't be able to shecht on Yom Tiv because that's not called a normative, common, everyday pleasure. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami da asr, the mishchetei. Maybe you'll say, therefore, it's asr to shecht the deer on Yom Tiv. Amrulei, ana davar hatzorech lechol nefesh kamina, tzvi tzarech lechol nefesh. So we'll say, literally what this means is, he said, I'm referring to something that is needed by all people, and deer meat is needed by all people. We'll say, what does this mean? In other words, what the Gemara is essentially answering is that we don't start getting into different categories of meat. The act of slaughter for food purposes is going to be permitted. We don't start getting into, you could slaughter this animal, not slaughter that animal. People eat this meat, people eat that meat. The concept of meat consumption is considered to be a normative, common pleasure, and therefore, halacha l'mais, you're allowed to do malacha for that on Yom Tiv. But again, going back to the mugmar case, the mugmar case would be a situation where halacha l'maisa, that's not a normative, common, everyday pleasure, and therefore, again, you would not be permitted to kindle a fire for the sake of burning that incense. Now, I will say the reason this is coming up is because we would include bia rishon, would include the first act of relations, more in the category of consumption, right, of food preparation, because again, the bia rishona would ultimately be in the category of a normative common pleasure. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Hor Rabbi Yochanan b'Tzaydon, Rabbi Yochanan paskin in Sidon, Asra livel b'tchila b'Shabbos. Ultimately, again, so Rabbi say here. So after we just got finished quoting all of these opinions, who say that, so Rabbi say, so here's what we have. We have opinions that say bia rishona is mutter on Shabbos. Then we have Rav Papa, who says bia rishon is mutter on Yom Tiv, but not mutter on Shabbos. Now, Rabbos, we have another psak halacha, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, that ultimately bia rishona is asr on Shabbos. Now, Rabbos say the lashon here is very important. He uses lashon of hora Rabbi Yochanan b'Tzaydon. Rabbi Yochanan hora, or hora, issued a ruling that bia rishona is asr on Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, "Mi ika hora le'isr." The Gemara doesn't use the term hora'ah which means to issue a ruling when it comes to a prohibition. The word hora is usually used in the context of permitting something. I will say, take a look at Rashi. This is very interesting. Umi ika hora leiser, umi kari iser hora. Do you ever call a prohibitive ruling a hora? Now, why is it? Listen to this. Mishum dechol adam rashay lahachmir va'oser ein zes michas dvarim shafilu min hasafek shen halacha berur lo hu ba va'oser avalamat yersomich ashmosa. So this is fascinating. The lashon of hora sounds like a person is using logic, intellect, reasoning, mesora, tradition. And that's why, again, because to permit something requires a lot more effort than to prohibit something. To make something usher, you can always make something usher. When in doubt, we're machmir. So the Gemara just pointed out, you don't usually find lashon of hora'ah, which usually means more of like almost like a cogitative process, like a cognitive process, a thoughtful process, an in-depth process. That term is usually used with a permissive ruling, not a prohibitive ruling. To which the Gemara says, it's not true. It's not true. We find the word used even by prohibitions. Vatana, we learned, so the example, without getting into this case, the Gemara is talking over here about the situation in Meseches Nazir with Queen Heleni Amalka, whose son went out to war, and she made a neder. She made a neder ultimately, again, that she would be a Nazira for 7 years if her son were to come back, healthy and whole. And also what ended up happening is she observed 7 years in Chutz La'aretz. And when she came back to Eretz Yisrael, Beis Hillel made her repeat the 7 years. So the point over here is you see Horu'u Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel paskin that she has to be a Nazira another 7 years. Now, being a Nazir another 7 years, once again, is a prohibitive ruling. And yet you see the lashon of hora with a prohibitive ruling. Okay, v'inami ki hadisanyo chuta shedra shenifsak berubo divrei Rabbi Yaakov. So we'll say this is about the halachos of, Rashi says over here, the halachos of treifa. There are certain injuries, traumatic injuries, that if an animal has, it's considered to be a treifa. A treifa is not permitted for consumption. Even if you shecht it with proper shchita, if you discover one of these mortal injuries, you're not permitted to consume the animal. So one of the examples of that is the spinal cord of the animal snapped, right? Shenifsak beruba, the majority of it is detached, right? So that's a treifa. Divrei Rebbe. Rabbi Yaakov Omer afilu nikev. Rabbi Yaakov says even if it's just pierced, even if it's not fully, right, even if it's not mostly detached, even if it's just pierced, that animal is a treifa. And I will say, what do you see from here? Hora Rebbe Rabbi Yaakov. And Gemara uses the lashon of Hora Rebbe. Rebbe paskind like Rabbi Yaakov. I will say Rabbi Yaakov is the more machmir. He gives the more prohibitive ruling. Even if there's just a piercing, right, a hole in the spine, that's enough to make the animal a treifa. So he's more machmir. He's prohibiting, and yet again the Gemara is using the lashon of hora. So from here you see halacha l'maisa that lashon of hora could be used for restrictive rulings as well. Amar Rav Huna ein halacha Rabbi Yaakov. Rav Huna said that halacha is not like Rabbi Yaakov. Okay, so both say, so bottom line, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak masni hachi. Both say first wide line Zayin Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Yavo shal Rabbi Yishmael ben Yaakov de Minsur es Rabbi Yochanan b'Tzaydon va'ana shami. So both say now comes Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Right, he says, they asked Rabbi Yochanan in Sidon, and I heard Mao livo b'tchila b'Shabbos. What is the halacha? Bottom line, is bia rishona permitted on Shabbos or not? V'hilchasa va'amar lei aser. Rabbi Yochanan in Sidon says aser. Bia rishona on Shabbos is aser. V'hilchasa mutar livo b'tchila b'Shabbos. Rabbi said the Gemara says halacha l'maisa bia rishona is permitted on Shabbos. And both say this is in fact how the Rambam paskins and how the Shulchan Aruch paskins, and this psak seems to be a combination of a couple of things. Number one, that we paskin dam besulam is mifkad pocket, that is considered to be collected and pulled outside of the body. Therefore, again, when the woman bleeds as a result of bia rishona, halacha l'maisa, that's not considered to be inflicting an injury, so to speak. That's not a chabura. It's not shchita. That's number one. Number two, we paskin like Rabbi Shimon that davar sheno miskavein is mutter, an unintended act that results in a malacha or is mutter. And number three, we'd have to also accept the idea that there is the concept of hatiyah, and therefore again it's not a psik reisha. It's not a psik reisha. So I will say, so again, other Rishonim bring in other factors as well, but I will just point out that we paskin halacha l'maisa, bia rishona is permitted on Shabbos. I will point out that the word is not to engage in bia rishona on Shabbos. And the Rama says, in communities where that was the minhag, ultimately again, that minhag should be maintained. Incredible. So we'll say, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Chelba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zavda, Amar Rav Acha. Amar Rav, Achas besula, the Achas almana to una bracha. We'll say fascinating sugya now. Now we're going to get into the sugya of Sheva brachas. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Right? So Rabbi Chelba says in the name of Rav Huna, says in the name of Rav Abba bar Zavda, and in the name of Rav, whether the woman is a besula, first marriage, or an almana, right, a widow, a second marriage, to una bracha. Rashi, right, she requires a bracha. Says Rashi, what bracha are you talking about? Tuna bracha, birchas chasanim. The brachos of chasanim. Now we're going to assume for our purposes now that this is a reference to Sheva brachas. Reference to Sheva brachas. Okay? Umiyama Rav Huna hachi. Did Rav Huna really say this? B'amar Rav Huna, amana eina tuna bracha. But Rav Huna said that an amana doesn't get Sheva brachas. Only a besula gets Sheva brachas. Now we'll say, by the way, when we speak about Sheva brachas over here, what we're referring to is 7 days of celebration, right after the wedding. That's only for a besula, not for an almana. To which the Gemara says, "Lokash, it's not a contradiction. Kan bibacha shenasa almana, kan bi almo shenasa masa." Very interesting. One is talking about a case of where the husband has never been married before, and he married an almana, he marries a widow, versus a case of a widower who marries a widow. So what the Gemara is suggesting is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, and we'll see this halacha l'maisa, when either the husband or the wife, when for either one of them, this is a first marriage, there are 7 days of celebration. There's Sheva brachas. But halacha l'maisa, for both of them, it is a second marriage, right? Again, whether they're both divorced, both widowed, whichever one it is, halacha l'maisa, there's only 1 day of Sheva brachas. When I say 1 day of Sheva brachas, that means Sheva brachas under the chuppah, right? The Sheva brachas that first day, but ultimately, again, there's no 7 days of celebration. The Gemara says, 1 second, is that true? That where it's a second marriage for both, a widower who married a widow, there's no Sheva brachas, there's no 7 days of celebration. V'amar Rav Nachman, Amar li Huna bar Nasan, Tana, minayin v'birchas chasanim ba'asara. How do we know about the concept that Sheva brachas has to take place with 10 men? How much you need 10 men for Sheva brachas? Shenemar vayikach asara anoshim miziknei ha'ir, vayomer shavu po, vayeshvu, Megillas Rus. Boaz assembles 10 men and he tells them, sit here, and they sat down. So the Gemara says, Uboaz almon shenasa manahava. And Boaz was a widower, right, who married Rus, who was a widow. And yet again, Bepashtus, he's gathering 10 men for Sheva brachas. So it sounds like even if it's a second marriage for both, there's still 7 days of celebration. To which the Gemara says, no. My eina tu'una bracha, the Amar Rav Huna eina tu'una bracha kol zayin. Aval yom echad tu'una bracha. I jumped the gun on this a little bit. I'll say what it means is like this: when it's a second marriage for both parties, there are not 7 days of Sheva brachas, right? Not 7 days of Sheva brachas. There's 1 day of Sheva brachas. In other words, the day of the wedding is a day of Sheva brachas, but halacha l'maisa, no 7 days of celebration. Elahad d'sanya shaktu chachama takonos penois sheisamech ima gimel yamim. I will say, what about the concept that we had 2 days ago on Sunday's daf? Ultimately, again, where we spoke about the concept that Chazal wanted to make sure that when it's a second marriage for a woman, right, an almana or a grusha, that she should get married on a Thursday night. This way, again, she has 3 days with her husband, Thursday, Friday, Shabbos. So the Gemara says, B'mai. Now we'll say, what is the case of 3 days of celebration? Ibe Bachar, if ultimately, again, we're talking about that the woman who's an almana is marrying a first marriage guy, then there's 7 days of Sheva brachas, right? Iba almon, and if he's second marriage for him as well, ha'amrit yom echad, there's only 1 day of Sheva brachas. What's going on over here? Ibais ema ba'almon yom echad lebracha shlosh l'simcha. Oh, so we'll say this is fascinating. Says the Gemara, it's possible here that what's happening is like this. Maybe there's 2 concepts. There's a concept of Sheva brachas, and there's a concept of simcha, of just rejoicing with your bride, rejoicing with your wife. So the Gemara says like this: halacha l'maisa, if one of the parties was never married before, then it's 7 days of Sheva brachas. If both the parties were married before, it's only 1 day of Sheva brachas. but 3 days of simcha. 3 days in which they're supposed to spend time together and rejoice with one another. The other possibility is that halacha l'maisa, if it's a situation where it's the first marriage for the man and ultimately second marriage for the woman, there are 7 days of Sheva brachas, but halacha l'maisa, 3 days of bracha. So, of simcha, rejoicing with each other. Rabbi say Amud Beis. I have to go back to a Tosas, but we'll do that at the end. Says the Gemara, Meisvei. Then it says, Menarei Zekasha, Mevarchen lebsula shiva ula amana yom echad. I will say with the Brisa says, we go ahead and we make Sheva brachas for a basula for 7 days, and for an amana only 1 day. My love afilu amana sheniseis lebachar. Now, both say when it says that for an amana only 1 day of Sheva brachas, isn't that even if for her husband this is his first marriage? Lo la'almon. No. When it says there's only 1 day of Sheva brachas, that's when a widow marries a widower. Aval bachar mai, but if she marries what we call a bachar is it's his first marriage. What's the halacha? Shiva, 7 days of Sheva brachas, even though she's an almana. Ihachi, if that's the case, listening mevarchin lebsula shiva ula amana sheniseis lebachar shiva ula amana yom echad. So I say if that's the case, then we should write as follows. For basula, if the woman is a basula, she always gets 7 days of Sheva brachas, and for an almana who married a bachar, 7 days, and for an almana who went ahead and almon changes it, and if the almana marries a widower, yom echad, only 1 day. To which the Gemara says, no. Milsa psikta katani. The Brisa wanted to write things in a complete or absolute form. The leka basula de basra mishiva, because it also wants to teach you, any case where the woman is a basula is always going to be 7 days of Sheva brachas. The leka almana de basra yom echad. And I will say, there is never a case where there's less than 1 day of Sheva brachas. So I will say, if you bring this all together, we come out with something very interesting, which is halacha l'maisa. And this is halacha l'maisa. Whenever it is a first marriage for either of the parties, there are 7 days of Sheva brachas. So again, that's true whether first marriage for the man, second marriage for the woman, first marriage for the woman, second marriage for the man. Halacha myself, one of the parties is a first marriage, 7 days of Sheva brachas. If it's a second marriage for both of them, then all you have are Sheva brachas on the day of the wedding itself. It appears that in that case where it's ultimately, again, 1 day of Sheva brachas, that there would be an additional concept of 3 days of simcha. And the truth is, we've seen that before, because halacha l'maisa, when you're marrying the almana or the grusha for that matter, you get married on Thursday. And again, we saw Chazal that we have Thursday, Friday, Shabbos together, even though only 1 day of Sheva brachas, halacha l'maisa, 3 days of simcha. Pretty incredible. Let's go weiter. So Gufa, let's go back and examine something interesting. So Gufa, Amrav Nachman, Amrav Huna Bar Nasan. So we said before, Huna Bar Nasan said, Minayim leberchas chasan and ba'asara. How do we know that Sheva brachas ultimately requires a minyan? Shne'emar ve'ikach asara anoshim miziknei ha'ir vayomer shavu po. So we'll say we learn out the concept that Sheva brachas requires a minyan from Boaz marrying Rus. Rabbi Avo or Mehacha. And Rabbi Avo said ultimately again from here. The both says beautiful. The Makelos Baruch Hu Elokim Hashem Imkar Yisrael. So both say the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Tehillim, which literally means the Makelos Baruch Elokim Hashem. In other words, in the Makelos, the Kahal, the great assemblies, bless Hashem, right? Bless Elokim Hashem Imkar Yisrael. Hashem is blessed. Mimkar. Now, what does this mean, Mimkar Yisrael? If you look at Rashi says it's very beautiful. Second line from the top in Rashi, B'makilos Baruch Hu Elokim Hashem Mimkar Yisrael, Al Birchas Mikar Tzarech Kal. For the bracha of the Makar. Now, we're going to see Makar is another term for the womb. So what's the Birchas Makar? That's Sheva brachas. A bracha it's the bracha on the womb, so to speak. In other words, that what we hope for the chassan and kala more than anything is that they're able to have a mishpacha, they're able to have a family. So the birchas makar. So ultimately, we're making the birchas makar, we're making the bracha on the womb, the bracha of marriage, the bracha of piriv arivya. How do you do that? B'makelos, with a kahal, with 10 people. So Rashi says over here, look at the rest of that Rashi. Al birchas mekar tzarech kal. When making the bracha on the makar on the womb, i.e. Sheva brachas, you need a minyan. V'hainu asara. And I will say that, what's a kal? Now, by the way, how do you know what a kal is? A kal, or a kehila, an assembly, is at least 10. Kimo hakel es ha'eda, vein hakel bepachos me'eda, ve'eda asara. So we'll say, we'll discuss this limud. Ultimately, the pasuk says, hakel es ha'eda, gather the eda. Eda is 10. How do we know that? Where do we know that from? We know because Torah uses lashon of Eda by the Meraglim. And remember again, Yoshua and Kalev were not part of the assembly of the Meraglim, which means Eda's 10. So Hakel Es HaEda, create a Kehila out of the Eda means you need at least 10. And therefore, B'makelos, when we're speaking about a bracha on the Makar that requires a Kehila, that requires 10. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman b'hai krod Rabbi Avo my darish bey. What does Rav Nachman do with the pasuk of Rabbi Avo? So the Gemara says, "Mibayle lechidisanyo." He needs it for the following. Listen to this. Lechidisanyo. Hayar Meir Abba says so beautiful. Minay shafilu ubrim shebemay iman. So Abba says, remember again. I just want to point out what's happening over here. Rav Nachman learns out the concept that Sheva brachos require a minyan from Boaz. From Boaz. Okay, so what does he do with this pasuk of Makelos Baruch Elokim Hashem Imkari? So what does he do with that pasuk? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. He needs it for the following. How Rabbi Meir used to say as follows: Minayin shafilu ubrim shebemai iman amru shira alayam. This is so beautiful. How do we know that even babies in utero, right? Even babies in utero sang shira, sang az yashir by the Yam Suf. How do we know that? Shene'emar b'makelos baruchu Elokim Hashem mimkar Yisrael. Rabbi said this is so beautiful. So he quotes it from that pasuk. B'makelos baruchu Elokim Hashem. Ultimately, again, when Klal Yisrael was assembled by the splitting of the Red Sea, everyone sang, including mimkar Yisrael, those who were in the womb. So from here, ultimately, Rabbi Meir says, you see from here, that this is so incredible, that by the Yam Suf, by the splitting of the Yam Suf, not only did the people who were present sing Shira, but even the fetuses, even the babies in utero sang Shira as well. And I will say, the Gemara says, V'idach, if that's the case, Im kein lemakra mi beten, let it say mi beten. My mimkar, what does it mean mimkar? Al iske makar. The pasuk is referring to matters of the womb. What does it mean, matters of the womb? That's a reference to marriage. Rabbi Avo, b'haikrad Rav Nachman, my darish bey. Ultimately, again, Rav Nachman. Let's just finish the sugya. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Avo, b'haikrad Rav Nachman, my darish bey. Rabbi Avo, what do you do with the pasuk of Rav Nachman by Boaz? Right? He doesn't need the pasuk by Boaz. So what do you do with the pasuk by Boaz? My darish bey. Hoi baile lemedrash amoni velo amonis, moavi velo moavis. Oh. Well, say when Boaz was gathering 10 men together, he wasn't gathering them, says Rabbi Avo. He wasn't gathering them for Sheva Brachos. He was gathering them because he needed to make reinforce and remind everyone of a very important halachic ruling. What was the halachic ruling? That when the Torah says, Lo yavo amoni umoavi b'kal Hashem, that an Ammonite and a Moabite may not come into the assembly of Hashem, may not join the Jewish people, that's referring to the male members of Ammon and Moab. It does not prohibit the females. Why did Boaz need to do this? Because Boaz was going to marry Rus, and he needed people to know that marrying Rus was absolutely, unequivocally permitted. That's why he gathered the 10 people to go ahead and teach them the ruling. Also, I want to be clear, Boaz wasn't introducing the ruling. The ruling was already on the books. It was already there. Boaz was reminding the general populace about the ruling. To which the Gemara says, because ultimately, again, if it's just Sheva Brachas, if he's just gathering the 10 guys for Sheva Brachas, why does the pasuk in Megillas Rus say that he was gathering elders? The minyan of Sheva Brachas could be anyone. The fact that he's gathering elders would seem to indicate to us that he's doing something of much greater importance. If he's reinforcing and reminding a halacha that is on the books, that it makes sense that he wants to gather the zikanim for that process. V'idach, other people will say, so comes along Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman will say, but one second. If that's the case, Rabbi Avo, that all Boaz was doing was teaching a ruling, a halachic ruling, why did he need a minyan? Why did he need a minyan? Why did he need 10 men? So Rav Nachman would say, it must be that he was doing Sheva Brachos. To which the Gemara says, V'idach. So in Lefarsume Milsa, no, the reason he got 10 together, we'll say, is because he wanted to review the halacha and he wanted to publicize the halacha. He needed the halacha to become part of public record. So the best way to do that is how? Get a gathering of people together. As Shmuel said to Rav Chana Bagarata, Pok va'aisi li be'asara ve'imracha ba'an payu. So one time, Shmuel said to Rav Chana Bagarata, quick, go out, gather together 10 men. I want to teach a very important halacha. What's the halacha? Hamizaki lu'uber kana. If one conveys ownership of property to an uber, to a fetus, it's a proper conveyance. Suppose the Gemara says, by the way, as an aside, the hilcha saw hamazaka lo kana. No, it's actually we don't pass on that. We pass on halacha lemaisa that if you try to convey something to a fetus, the conveyance is ineffective. You can't, right? The fetus is a davar shel ba'olam; it's not yet in existence, and therefore halacha lemaisa you can't convey any ownership of anything to it. So I will say, I'll just point out to you something very interesting. So again, if we kind of bring this all together, here's what we have. Right? New marriage, first marriage for either of the parties, 7 days of Sheva Brachas. Second marriage for both of the parties, 1 day of Sheva Brachas. It sounds like halacha l'maisi, even in a case where there's 1 day of Sheva Brachas, there'll be 3 days of Simcha. We know that halacha l'maisa, again, Sheva Brachas requires a minyan. How do we know that? Machlokes. Rav Nachman brings down the pasuk ultimately by Megillas Rus. Ultimately, again, Rav Yavo brings down the pasuk of Makelos, Baruch Elokim Hashem Mimkar Yisrael. I will say, I'll just go back for just a moment, and I'll mention something interesting. So remember again, Rabbi Avo went ahead and, Rav Nachman, on that pasuk of Makelos, Baruch Elokim Hashem Mimkar Yisrael. So Rav Nachman says that pasuk is a reference to Yamsuf, and teaches us that by Yamsuf, even the uber, even the fetus inside of its mother, sang Shira. So you wonder to yourself, what's the point of that? I mean, it's fascinating and it's riveting and it's absolutely amazing. But Lamaisa, what is the importance or what is the lesson of the uber, of the fetus, saying Shira from within its mother's womb? And I will say, perhaps I was thinking about this idea. Rabbi Nachman says that one of the reasons when we recite Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, we cover our eyes. And the Rebbe says something so beautiful. He explains because sometimes to really see things as they are, you have to close your eyes. You see, the great challenge in life is often we see things and we think we see reality. But the truth is, when I see things in life, I see things through my lens. I see things through my vision. And the truth is, my vision is slanted, tainted, predisposed because of my own leanings, proclivities, predispositions, life experiences. So often, I don't really see things for what they are. I see things the way I think I know what they are, but myself I don't. The power of saying Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad with your eyes closed, that sometimes the best way to see things is not to look with your eyes, but to look with your heart, to look with your soul, to really try to retreat within yourself and try to understand yourself, try to understand the world. And perhaps that's what's happening over here. Perhaps the Gemara is saying is that to a certain degree, the most beautiful Shira was sung by the babies inside of their mother's womb. Because the truth is, those babies didn't see anything with their eyes. They saw it with their soul. They saw it with their neshamas. They saw it with their heart. And Chazal is sensitizing us to that so often in life. We see something, and I size it up. I see a person, I've got your number. I've got you all sized up. I know exactly who you are, what you are, and I don't. Or I see situations, and I jump to conclusions, or I think I see it a certain way. It's so important in life to sometimes be like the uber b'mai imo, to sometimes be like the child in utero, to be a Shema Yisrael Jew, where I recognize that sometimes the best way to see something is not with your eyes, but to close your eyes and to try to see with your heart, to try to see with your neshama. Sometimes when you don't look with your eyes and you look with the heart, you look with the neshama, that's when you're able to see things. That's when you're able to see yourself for who and what you really are. Such an incredible yisod. The Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tana Abanon, Mevarchen birchas chasana veis chasana. Both say, so back to Sheva Brachas. We didn't leave Sheva, we're still in Sheva Brachas. So listen to this. Tana Abanon, Mevarchen birchas chasana veis chasanim. We make Sheva Brachas in what we call the Beis Chasanim. Rashi says over here, Beis Chasanim, kishenichnasa l'chupas nisuin. Beis Chasanim is another name for the chuppah. When do we make Sheva Brachos? The first time we make Sheva Brachos is when the couple goes into the chuppah. Incredible. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Beis HaErusin. Rabbi Yehuda says we even say Sheva Brachos where? In Erusin. Interesting. So Rabbi Yehuda's model is even during Erusin, right? Ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi, Af Beis HaErusin, Kishem Ekanshem Mevarchim Kol Birchas Chasanim. Ultimately, again, when there's Kiddushin, as soon as there's Kiddushin, Erusin, we do Sheva Brachos as well. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda's statement that we make Sheva Brachas even during Erusin was dafka said in the tribal area of Yehuda. We call the region of Yehud in Eretz Yisrael. What was unique about the region of Yehud in Eretz Yisrael? Ultimately, again, Meshem Mesachid, also we'll talk about this, that in Yehuda they had a very interesting practice, which was that they would ensure that the chassan and kala were secluded with each other for a number of different times before their wedding, so that they would be comfortable with one another. Well, we're going to see that sometimes the plan worked a bit too well, and the chassan and kala became a bit too comfortable with each other. So we'll get into that in Meretz Hashem. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Shemes Yachid Ima, Be'erusin Kadesh Libo Gaspa. So in Yehuda, it's interesting practice. They wanted the chassan and kala to spend time alone with each other in order that they would become familiar, connected with each other. It's a great idea. So we're going to see, it's interesting, that in Yehuda, and again we'll see this sugya, but in Yehuda, they were careful to have the chassan and kala alone with each other. And Lamaisa, again, after Erusin, remember, after Erusin, they're husband and wife already, and sometimes they would end up having relations, or a physical relationship. So Rabbi say, so the problem just is, we're going to see, she would go to the mikvah after Erusin, and ultimately they would do Sheva Brachas as well, because Sheva Brachas is a necessary piece to allow a chassan and kala to live together. So like I said, we're going to talk, this sugya deserves more attention, but just understand when Rabbi Yehuda says that we even do Sheva Brachas during Erusin, that's not the normative practice. This was perhaps something that was dafka done in the region of Yehuda. Tanya Idach, another brisa. We go ahead and we make Sheva Brachas. Beis Chasanim. We'll say Beis Chasanim means the chuppah. The chuppah. Or Birchas Erusin, Beis HaErusin. Oh, there's a bracha of Erusin. And make the bracha of Erusin ultimately during Erusin. Remember again, let's just get our stages done correctly over here, or straightened out. Erusin, initial stage of marriage. Now again, the truth is, a man could affect Erusin in three different ways: kesef, money; shtar, document; bia, relations. Let's just go with kesef. Chassan gives the kala an item of value. She accepts it for the sake of kiddushin. They now are married in a state kiddushin, what we call Erusin. There was a bracha on Erusin. Bracha on Erusin. So you make Sheva Brachas by the chuppah, that's nisuin, and a bracha of Erusin by Erusin, to which the Gemara says, Berachas Erusin, Berachas Erusin, what is the bracha over Erusin? So Rav Ada, Rav Bar Rav Ada, Tarvai Moshe, Rav Yehuda, Amri, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Asher Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Asher Kiddusha Mitzvosav Tzivanu al ha'arayos. Hashem, you've commanded us to avoid the arayos, to avoid immorality. Va'asar lanu es ha'arusos. You prohibited to us to live with a woman who is just an arusa, not nisuin. And you permitted for us to live with an arusa after there is chuppah and kiddushin. So both saying that is the bracha of Erusin. So the Gemara says, so again, this is the bracha of Erusin. Good. Rav Acha Breid Rabba Messiah Moshe Rav Yehuda. And I will say Rav Acha Breid Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav Yehuda that there is a concluding bracha to that Berachas Erusin. Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael Al Yidei Chuppah V'Kiddushin. He added on a concluding bracha. So both say, so here's what's interesting. Everyone is agreeing with the Iker text, the primary text of the bracha of Erusin, which essentially is the bracha that says, Hashem, you've commanded us to avoid immorality. Okay, Asulana Sa'arayos, right? You commanded us regarding Arayos. You prohibited us to live with an Arusa. Permitted to us a Nesua once there is Chuppah and Kiddushin. That's according to the first opinion, that's the bracha. Rav Yehuda adds on, now there's a concluding bracha, Baruch atah Hashem mekadesh Yisrael al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin. Hashem, you are the source of all blessing, who sanctifies the Jewish people through chuppah and kiddushin. So what's the machlokes? Man delo chasem mididav aberchas peras aberchas mitzvos. Shabbos, the opinion, i.e. the first one, here Rav Ada, in the name of Rav Yehuda, holds that the bracha over Erusin is like any other birchas ha-mitzvah. He says it's like any other bracha you make on a mitzvah, or for that matter, bracha you make on fruit, right? Where there's a bracha Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, rest of the bracha, and there's no concluding bracha phrase. Now, why is there no concluding bracha phrase? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, birchas peros, bar pre'etz, birchas mitzvos, ala shchita, ala mila, the kevan de kula chada hodahi, ve'ein hefsek bakasha bein sayim. I will say, this is actually very interesting. There are two different types of brachos. There's what's called a bracha kitzara and a bracha arichta. A bracha kitzara is like a short bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, subject of bracha, done. A longer bracha is Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, subject of bracha, concluding bracha, which summarizes the theme of the bracha. Generally, the only time you have that second model of bracha, the elongated bracha form, is when in the bracha itself there's an interruption, or there's more than one topic. Let's say there's a topic and then ultimately there's a request. So where there's an interruption, so to speak, from the primary theme, that's when we go back and summarize the bracha in a concluding bracha. So the first opinion says, this bracha maintains one coherent theme throughout. So therefore, there's no need for a concluding bracha. The second opinion, so the Gemara says, so man dachasim midi dehavi akidusha. The one who says that no, you have to end off with a concluding bracha. Baruch atah Hashem mekadesh Yisrael al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin. Why do you have to add that in? He says because this bracha is like kiddush. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Midi dehavi akidusha kevan debelashon kiddushehi ki kiddushe hayom chasminan ba. So what is interesting? That essentially, since this bracha has a lashon of kiddusha, sanctified, therefore again we model this bracha after the bracha of kiddush. We know that Kiddush ultimately again has a bracha. Let's say Friday night again, it's Berei Pri Hagafen, and then you have the Yom HaShishi, Berei Pri Hagafen, and then you have a bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos, right? And again, remember, you start off with Baruch and you end with Baruch. So Rashi says over here, Ki hasam debahi chasmin mishum diyesh bahafsek gom ki hu yom tchilu mikray kodesh. They both say, this is actually interesting. In Kiddush, you have a couple of different themes in the bracha of Kiddush. So because of that, you start the bracha of Kiddush, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, right? And then you conclude Baruch atah Hashem. So the Gemara is suggesting that according to the second opinion, even though in this particular bracha it's one theme, but because the bracha references Kiddusha, therefore it's modeled after Kiddush and therefore has the concluding bracha. Beautiful. I will say, how do we paskin? We paskin like the second approach. So if you look at the bracha that we make over Erusin, I will remember again, today we do everything together under the chuppah, right? We do Erusin and Nisuin all together under the chuppah. But remember again, when the chassan and kala are first standing under the chuppah, that first glass of wine is where we make the bracha on Erusin. And the bracha we make, Rabosa, is the second version. It's the long bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushan v'sasav v'tzivanu ala harayos, v'asal lanu hasarusos, v'hitir lanu hasanusos, lanu al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin. Baruch atah Hashem mekadesh Yisrael al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin. Again, different versions of the bracha. But Lamaisa, that's the bracha. That's the bracha. Remember again, when chassan and kala drink, and then right after that is when the chassan gives the kala of the ring. That affects kiddushin. Remember, just to walk you through it, then what do we do? Then we read the Kesuva. The reading of the Kesuva is just there to break up between Erusin and Nisuin, Kiddushin and Nisuin. And then ultimately we get into Nisuin. What's going to be Nisuin? So Nisuin is going to be Chuppah itself, Sheva Brachas, and ultimately Yichud, but we'll see that later on. Abosai, we will stop over here for today. Tremendous Yasher Koach. I look forward. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you in person. I miss all of you, but it's a great chus at least to be able to learn virtually together. And I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and shchayach on another incredible daf. Kol tov.